Okay, so in the U.S., these are our presidents during this post-World War II era up until the 1970s. So we got Truman over here, again, the guy who dropped the bomb on Japan. Next guy who's going to take over is Eisenhower. That should sound kind of familiar because there's, the highway that's in our city named after Eisenhower. He's also helps build the highways, which is why it's named after him. We get John F. Kennedy, and then we finally get the second best LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson, first best, we all know. The USSR, though, because their government is set up in a different way, you only have two leaders during this time period. Obviously, you can tell we have more elections going on than they do. We obviously have Joseph Stalin, who's going to take over until 53, until he dies. And then Khrushchev, who takes over right after Stalin. Khrushchev is a little bit nicer. Stalin obviously kills a lot of people. Khrushchev tries to stop a lot of that stuff that they're doing. Okay. What the U.S. aims to do is basically create a world in which all nations have the right to pursue democracy. So if you think about when we talked about earlier, when I said that the U.S. wants, from their perspective, they're saying, hey, we're giving everyone the right to have whatever government they want. It's not technically true because they kind of want everyone just to have democracy. They want to rebuild European governments and establish markets to sell American goods there. So basically they want to rebuild Europe so that they can trade with Europe, so that they can make money off of Europe. And then they want to reunite Germany, saying that if Germany is secure, then the rest of Europe will be secure. The US, France, and Great Britain are very afraid that if Germany is not united and is broken up, then their economy will not be as strong, and then it'll lead again to another dictator coming up, and then another World War II. Soviet Union ideologies. They want to encourage communism in other countries, whether it be by, gently asking or basically telling them that, you need to be communist by threat of war. They want to rebuild Europe using Eastern Europe's industrial equipment and raw materials, kind of like what the U.S. wants to do. They kind of want to rebuild Europe to make money off of it. They want to control Eastern Europe to help balance the U.S. and capitalist influence in Western Europe. And they want to keep Germany divided and weak so that it's never going to threaten to invade them again. Again, keep in mind that they had just been invaded during World War II. They'd also been invaded during World War I. They'd also been invaded by Napoleon before that. Not Napoleon. World War II and World War I. So obviously they are afraid that if Germany gets powerful again, they're going to keep the pattern going and invade them again. All right. So post-war conferences, we have Potsdam in Germany, where Truman, Stalin, and Churchill basically sit down. So Truman for the U.S., Stalin for the USSR, Churchill for England. They're sitting down trying to figure out how we're going to end this war, who gets to keep what, basically, or in other words, the U.S. and Great Britain trying to get Stalin to leave a lot of the areas that he had taken over during the war. So we have Soviet troops in Eastern Europe. Stalin says that, hey, we're not going to have free elections, we're just going to have communism. And these Eastern Europe countries that are not Russia, so they're technically a separate country, but they're a part of the Soviet Union. These are going to be called satellite nations. And just to give you these would be basically the Soviet Union's satellite nations. So again, nations that are separate from mainland Russia, but are under the influence of the Soviet Union. So those are what satellite states are. All right. So the USSR insists on having friendly neighbors. And why would they want friendly neighbors? Because they don't want to get invaded by Germany again. They also are afraid that the US or Great Britain is going to try to invade them as well. And basically they put up this, it's coined by Churchill as a quote-unquote Iron Curtain, and it's basically dividing Europe between communist Europe and capitalist Europe. So this would be basically the Iron Curtain, would be right in here. So in Germany, Germany's capital is Berlin. Berlin's a very powerful city. Obviously, it's on the Soviet Union side, but Great Britain and the US did not want to give up control over such a powerful city. So inside of Berlin, if we look here, Berlin is also split in half. You have Soviet Union Berlin, and you have British, American, France, Berlin. So that's inside this city. So technically, this tiny little green piece in here is like right about there. Okay, so we want to make some peace because we want to bring the end of World War II. It would be nice for everybody. So at the Yalta Conference in 1945, we have what are we called the Big Three, which is Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, discuss what they want to do after the war, how they're going to divide Germany, like I just showed you, what they're going to do about the Soviet Union in the Pacific area, meaning like Japan and those kind of islands. Stalin insists on having friendly neighboring governments because he doesn't want to be invaded. And Roosevelt doesn't really turn out too good in this. He seems a little too like overeager against communism. They also developed the United Nations during this time period. If you remember, we tried to do this after World War I with the League of Nations, but the U.S. never joins. United Nations, the U.S. will join. 46 nations are represented, and we have the Security Council, which has 5 permanent seats and 10 elected, and the General Assembly. So the United Nations is basically set up to figure out conflicts before they turn into war. These 5 permanent seats, though, are the United States, Great Britain, China, Russia, and I can't remember the last one off the top of my head, but basically those people can just, if something comes up and one of those countries says no, it's automatically no. Like, no matter how many votes it gets, if one of those 5 countries says no, it's automatically no. So they have a lot of power when it comes to the UN. Iron Curtain, we talked about this a little bit ago. Here's our Iron Curtain going through Europe. Basically, he calls it an Iron Curtain because Stalin doesn't want anyone fleeing to Western Europe because he doesn't want people telling them how bad it is inside these satellite nations. So he basically keeps anyone from leaving. So what the U.S. is going to do with communism is they want to avoid a world war again because they had just fought in one. I feel like I've been saying this for the last 4 months. So their big idea is, okay, communism is here. The best thing we can do to avoid going to war, but to also keep it from spreading, is to just contain it. So they have a policy of containment. So you're trying to stop the spread of communism. You're not trying to destroy communism. You're just trying to stop it from spreading. So they do this through 2 specific documents. One of them is the Truman Doctrine, which gives $400 million in aid and tons of military equipment to Greece and Turkey to help them fight communist rebels. And the Marshall Plan, which gives countries in Europe $13 billion to spend in Europe to help them rebuild, as long as obviously they're rebuilding a non-communist government. So yeah, Truman Doctrine, basically giving money to any government that's trying to put down any communist revolutions. Again, this idea of containment, you want to keep communism from spreading. Again, Marshall Plan, we just literally talked about this. You get money basically as long as you're not working with the Soviet Union. You can see all the money that the U.S. is spending in all these places, and you can see right where it stops, because obviously these are Soviet Union satellite countries, or satellite nations, I'm sorry, and Soviet Union supported places, but they're basically trying to, you're almost trying to bribe these countries not to go communist. Again, Iron Curtain, you can see how divided Europe is. Okay, so the U.S., France, and Great Britain want to actually unify West Germany. Their fear is that if it's split up between these 3 countries, that those are weaker chunks in case the Soviet Union does try to invade. So they want to unify Western Germany. From the Soviet perspective, though, they're going to see this as, oh no, Germany's getting stronger, and they're probably going to try to invade us again. From France, Great Britain, and the U.S.'s perspective, they're saying if we have poor economic conditions, by not unifying them, these poor economic conditions last time gave rise to the Nazis, and we're trying to avoid that. Like I said, so the Soviet Union is going to be very threatened by this. They were already attacked by Germany twice during the century. They want Germany to stay weak. So basically what they do is they build a Berlin blockade, which is going to cut off and cut in half the city of Berlin, and it's going to cut off all the supplies to West Berlin. Because if you remember, inside Berlin, it's inside the USSR territory. So if he cuts off all the roads to here, there's still technically that half that is owned by these three countries, but they can't get to it, obviously, because he can cut off all the roads because it's surrounded by the USSR. Yeah. So here's inside Berlin. Here's Germany split up, and then specifically inside Berlin, since all of this is technically USSR territory, they can just cut everything off, which is what they do. So now these three countries have to figure out what to do because they have this land inside of Berlin, which is not going to get any supplies, food, or anything like that. They don't want to send in tanks and everything because that would obviously start a war, so they have to figure out another way around this. So, like we said, France, Britain, and the US unify West Germany. Soviets retaliate by blocking all transportation to Berlin. So Truman, who is the president of the US at this time, has basically three options. He could go to war, which is basically going to start another world war, so World War III, right after you just got out of World War II. You can give up West Berlin as your second choice, or you can defend Berlin without any war, so basically just sending troops but saying, don't fire. So we have to figure out what the US is going to do. So what they do is kind of ingenious. It's called the Berlin Airlift. Truman basically uses military planes to supply the city for over 300 days. Basically all they do is they take planes from the American zone and they fly them over to Berlin where they have their little area there, and then they drop supplies down. And they were having planes basically going every hour in order to drop enough food and supplies to keep them going. So after these 300 days, Stalin eventually gives in and opens up the roads. It makes the U.S. look good because they were able to basically win without going to war. It makes the USSR look bad because they look weak compared to the U.S. All right, so NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They're still around. It's basically, NATO is a conglomeration of, it's just countries grouping together based on the fact that they're all capitalists. Their idea is an attack on one is an attack on all. So it'll be countries like the U.S., Great Britain, France, and they're basically saying if the USSR attacks France, that's an attack on both the U.S. and Great Britain because we're all teamed up in this NATO pact. So we would all have to attack. It's kind of like all those alliances that led us to World War I. The whole idea, though, is, again, to protect each other from communist aggression. If your enemy is teaming up, then you may want to team up yourself. So that's what the USSR does. Basically, it's the USSR and its satellite nations make the thing called the Warsaw Pact. Again, same thing. Attack on one is an attack on all. So again, we can just see how divided they are. Some countries are able to stay, neutral. Okay. Last thing we're going to just talk about to kind of give you a roadmap of where we are to catch us up to the Korean War, which is what we'll do next. Domestic affairs, so stuff happening inside the U.S. Truman has a surprise victory in 1948. Basically, he's also going to expand the government, try to give people some help after they're recovering from the end of World War II. We have NATO, we have Warsaw, which is just what we talked about, and that should basically be it. Your second word then that you need to write up at the top of your worksheet is rare, R-A-R-E, the word rare. So your two words should be, one is gears and the second one is rare. Thank you for listening, and I will speak to you guys soon.